So I'm right in the middle of trying to explain the true version of the theorem that John stated. And let me try to write down the statement of the theorem. And I'll write it down a little bit differently so we've been writing anything. Vector space enriched category of finite d-sets as the objects and Hecke operators as the morphism. And I'm going to do it vector space and something over the complex numbers.
So those are just intertwining operators?
Yes. Yes. Intertwining operators between the permutation representations that you get when you turn these d-sets into permutation representations. This vector space enriched category is the decategorification of the category enriched category I guess the same objects but instead of having this Hom vector space of Hecke operators, we're having this Hom category, actually. And I guess we call it like the span category. I guess I'll underline it to indicate that it's a category. So this is the theorem, stated slightly differently from the way John was stating it. One way it's slightly different is that John was doing a sort of a refinement of this, where he was, instead of working over the ring, instead of working over the field of complex numbers, he was working over the ring of natural numbers. I'm not going to do this quite that refined. I'm going to do this more from a thing of working over the complex numbers. And let's see, there are certain words in this statement here that become issues when you're trying to make sure that you're stating the theorem correctly. So what do we mean by the decategorification in this context? And so I think what John originally stated the theorem, he stated it badly or completely or wrongly or something. And basically using the wrong kind of decategorification. And I've been trying to fix the theorem by using the right kind of decategorification. And so that's what we've been getting into, trying to explain what's the right concept of decategorification to use here. And there might be some other terminology terms that are showing up here that we may have to focus on at some point. So for example, what do we mean when we talk about category enriched category, or also a vector space enriched category. So there's this notion of enrichment of categories that's a significant ingredient to what's going on here. In particular, there's a relationship between this concept of enrichment of categories and this concept of decategorification that we're talking about. So, enrichment of categories, what does that mean? That means when you have a category, where the Hom spaces, the Hom sets, are not just sets, but have some extra nice structure.
So is an enrichment always done with, it's always done with a category?
Yeah, I'll make some generalization, but yeah.
No, that's fine, but you can do it with just categories. Your categories don't have to be like anything better than an ordinary category.
Right, except that the enrichment process makes them better.
Of course not.
Than an ordinary
No, I'm saying what you're enriched by is just can be any old category. It doesn't have to be any old.
Oh, what you're enriching by?
Yeah. The vector space will definitely be much better because it's a medium of a category. But I don't know about categories.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
so okay, there are some subtle questions there as to just what you can enrich by. As a general rule of thumb, you're going to probably need the thing that you're enriching by. You're probably going to need it to be tensored, because the reason you need to be tensored is because you're doing this kind of thing all the time. You're taking like from object X to object Y, and you're taking from object Y to object Z. And there's this idea of composing, which involves tensoring here and getting something here. So you're probably going to have a hard time enriching your category over some other category unless the thing you're enriching over has a tensor product. It's tensored.
So what's the tensor product?
Over here, it would be the Cartesian product of categories. Actually, that's a subtle question. No, actually, that's a subtle question.
We'll just say what, just go ahead.
Yeah, originally I'm thinking of it being the Cartesian product of categories, but there's actually going to be several ways of interpreting it. It's sort of like when you have an abelian category. You can interpret the tensor product that you're using in that case in several different ways. You can think of it as being enriched over abelian groups, in which case you're using tensor product of abelian groups. Yeah. But it's also, at the same time, abelian category is also just an ordinary category. So you can also think of it as just using ordinary Cartesian product of sets. So there's actually several different ways you can interpret it. When you change your mind about when you forget the enrichment. So yeah, we may have to think a bit about what tensor product we're going to use here. But to begin with, you could probably think of it being Cartesian product of categories.
So you mean if this is the category C, that's the category C prime, then the third one is the category C cross C prime.
No, it's not. We're not saying that this is isomorphic.
Oh, okay.
There's this composition map. So this,
Oh.
you take
C cross C prime and
yeah,
then you.
and then do that. Yeah. That's what a category enriched category is like. Category with a Hom section, or not just X, but has some nice extra structure. Or nice extra something. All the same structure. So I last time I described some examples of decategorification, but I really didn't give any very general definition of what decategorification is, and I'm probably still not going to, but I can say some things about it. So one thing to say about decategorification is the way that it gets along with enrichment, how it relates to enrichment. So suppose you have some decategorification process. It goes like this. I'm being very vague about what this decategorification process is, because all I want to do with this is use this as an ingredient to build a new, more complicated decategorification process that goes from A enriched categories to B enriched categories. And I guess I'll call this one also decategorification, but it's some slightly different decategorification process that's piggybacking on top of this decategorification process. And the way it works is that over here you have an A enriched category, let's call it C, and it goes to a B enriched category over here, and you do it by, you take the same objects as in C, but the new hom from like object X to XY is defined to be the decategorification, that's this decategorification up here, of the old hom. So I guess it's some sort of recursive way of building new decategorification processes from simpler old decategorification processes by this piggybacking process. So it's recursive. So in particular, it's one of those recursive processes that you can almost use it to, like, come up from nothing. You can build up from nothing practically. You can build decategorification processes in this way. So by that I mean that, for example, you could take the category of sex, and then you could take, as an example, sometimes a very trivial example of a decategorification process, you can take the most destructive imaginable process. So that would just take you to the terminal category. Category is just one object, one. And so you can think of this as a decategorification process.
The only thing it can. One is terminal.
Yeah,
Every object is one object, and every morphism is the only morphism.
yeah. So let's see what happens when we piggyback on top of this and see what we get. So we get set enriched categories. Going to one enriched category.
So we basically, our new category has all the objects, but the only thing it has is each object has an identity morphism.
In some sense, it's worse than that, because it's not just that each category has an identity morphism. If you take any two objects,
They're the same morphism.
yeah, any two objects have to have a hom object between them. And that hom object will have to be the trivial object. So it's actually, it's more like between any two objects, there's exactly one morphism.
And that's the trivial morphism.
Yeah, in some sense. And so this whole thing turns out to be very, very trivial in some sense. It's not quite as trivial as this.
Well, you should get them to work out what a one enriched category is.
Okay.
They should be able to do it. So it's a category where for any.
But before you do that, let me. Let me try to encourage you to think of this as an actual concrete category. Think of this as actually being the object. Think of this as being the category whose only object is the one element set. Because that will sort of help the intuition. It will allow you to think of these kind of.
Why is it the same?
What's that again?
All the hundred flies are the same. Right,
Well, what now? Is it the
First, figure out what a one enriched category is, then figure out what a set enriched category is, and then figure out what we're doing.
Well, I mean, a set enriched category is kind of like a generic. Well, I don't want to say generic version of a category.
Yeah, it is.
It's our generic version of a category with no enrichment, really.
Right.
It's a category.
Yeah.
Right.
So there is no. Yeah. So we haven't done the enrichment actually. Because
Right. So we don't have to worry about this. We know this, presumably. We're pretending that we understand this.
Right.
But over here, I'm trying to encourage you to think of this as a category where all of the hom sets, hom object, hom sets, are 1-point sets. That's what we're saying.
Okay.
And
So it's not that all the hom sets are the same. It's just that each hom set is a one-element set.
yeah, because I'm saying think of this category as being the category
They're all
when the only object is the one element set. So
They're
all
all
the hom
isomorphic.
sets. So say it again?
They're all isomorphic.
Yeah, all the objects are isomorphic, right. So
One.
all the objects in any one particular category.
Every hom set is isomorphic. Every other hom set is just a single element hom set.
Right. So there's just one morphism from anything to anything.
So, do you know about this idea of equivalence of categories? The two categories are, for example, you can have a skeleton category with just a unique object representing each isomorphism class, and then you can have a much fluffier equivalent category with lots of different copies of isomorphic copies of an object. And the skeleton can be equivalent, in the technical sense of equivalence of categories, to this category with lots of representatives of each isomorphism class. So, can you sort of classify these kind of categories up to equivalence? That's sort of a question I have. So, how many different categories of this kind can you think of? But then the question comes up, what do you mean by different? And
I think you should first get them to tell you what category that kind is.
up to isomorphism, let's say.
Oh, well, no, well, okay, yeah, upside. Just what is it? It's not as, I'm afraid that there's some people who are like terrified that it's some murky, complicated, and
No,
that it's easy
I'm
to,
more
maybe
worried
not
that
you.
I'm going to say something that's way too simple. And
Yeah.
it seems like I
No, it's
can.
incredibly simple.
It is incredibly simple. So, you describe what this is?
Well, what?
No, it's not
Well,
fine.
because it has more than one object in it. I mean,
Wait,
is it equivalent to one?
I'm having trouble with levels this year. I'm
Okay.
having trouble when people say more than one object, I don't know if they're talking about objects
Objects
in
in
this
yeah,
thing
objects
or
in
objects
categories.
in one of these categories. Say it again?
Yeah, objects, so a single category over there
Yeah,
that came from some category over here.
yeah.
Okay, so that single category is gonna have as many objects as the original category did,
Yeah.
but the there's only one morphism between each one of those objects in that category. And so, but what do we know about that one morphism? Why is it nice?
Well, but the question is, how much information do you have to give to describe one of these things? Never mind where it came from. Just one of these things.
How many objects it has?
You have to describe how many objects it has, and then, is there anything else you have to describe?
Not really, because
No.
there's only one morphism.
That's right. So really, all you have to do to give one of these things is just give a set.
Just draw a picture of one.
Right.
I have a feeling people are like, thinking this is abstract, but it's not.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out, do we
No, no,
actually know
that's
what
what
the
it is,
one,
but everyone else is not.
do we actually know what that one morphism is?
Spread.
I always, since it's unique, it's unique in its own homestead, so whenever I have a unique element of a set, I would just call it a star or something like that.
Okay, so we don't necessarily know what the morphism does from one object, if I'm given each object, we don't really have a lot of information on what that one morphism does, we just know there's only one morphism.
Yeah, there's nothing for it to do, it's just.
You have as much information as you need, it's just the one morphism from one.
I guess John is asking me to draw a complete graph here. which
Yeah,
is
that's right, you shouldn't have drawn so many vertices,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's the usual mistake.
And maybe I should include the morphisms, or maybe they're automatically included in the dot, something like that. But, yeah, I'm just trying to draw a complete graph here.
Yeah, some of the next.
But, okay, so yeah, so we established that you just give a set, and that's all you have to do to get one.
So for instance, can we talk about one English vect, just very complete specifically?
No, that doesn't make
You
any
just have to
sense.
specify the object in that, like, in the same category, or?
It's actually called co-discrete. Discrete is when you just specify the objects, but there are empty objects between different ones.
There's just the identity.
Oh.
Yeah, so this is like, yeah, this is called co-discrete, so it's the opposite of that. Instead of there being no morphisms between any pair, there's exactly one morphism between any pair. So, co-discrete, it's you know where the name co-discrete comes from in topology, it's sort of very connected, very highly connected, and it really is very highly connected. So it is sometimes called the co-discrete category, yeah. So okay, so John is trying to get us to say that there's one of these co-discrete categories for each set of objects. But that's not really the important thing here. The important thing here is what happens if you classify these co-discrete categories up to equivalence? With what? That's pretty close. One is very close. Any other guesses besides just one of them?
Two.
Oh, for the empty set or something?
Yes,
Oh.
yes. So, as long as there's at least one object, then all these co-discrete categories are close to each other. There's one inequivalent to all the others, and that's the empty co-discrete category.
So when you say no, this is what I'm trying to get, is that one morphism is itself an isomorphism between those two objects?
It has to be,
That's
because
what I'm saying, it has to be. It doesn't-
because it composed with the one going back can only be the identity, because there's nothing else for it to be.
Thank you, that's what I'm saying, so that's what I was missing, so that one, okay.
Yeah.
So
these are categories.
Okay.
Yeah, that there's only two kinds of isomorphisms. The point I'm thinking about one in this vect, for instance, is.
One enriched vect doesn't make any sense. One enriched.
Well, you can have this too. You can do this too.
Oh, is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, but the point is that you should not think of the morphisms as linear maps, because of course then you will not get isomorphisms.
Right, you can have all
Yeah,
sorts
not
of
these
fun,
linear
interesting
maps.
morphisms
Formal
in your
maps.
set enriched
So they
category,
all
but then they all
come-
get crushed down to one.
Right.
And even if there's none of them, it still gets crushed down to one.
Crushed up.
If there are none.
Yeah.
Oh, I had a question.
Yeah?
What is decaf supposed to be in the top line? Is it a bunker or? The and
Yes, I'm assuming that it's some sort of,
So it's any, and you can technically do this for any bunker, right?
well, again, I mean, so these things over here have to be have to allow some sort of, there have to be some sort of things that are like categories with tensor product. And these also have to be some sort of categories with tensor product.
There's some sort of.
And this probably has to preserve the tensor product in some sense. I'm being vague about it.
But yeah, you don't need it to necessarily be that this is more complicated than that. Of course,
Well,
we will talk of decategorification.
in order to philosophically deserve the name decategorification,
Sure,
it should be.
but this objection that you just did can be done for.
Yes, yes.
As a contribution.
And yeah, oh, and in fact, right, people do consider all, people want to consider ones that actually make it more complicated, because they don't call it.
You can do it, that's all.
Yeah, sometimes they will call they may call this a change of base, or a change of enrichment, or something like that. There are various names, I forget exactly what they call it. So I think we convinced ourselves that there are exactly two equivalent classes of these things over here. Is that at all suggestive? Is there anything else that you can think of that you've got two of? What? What do you think? Yeah, truth values, right. So this is actually a way to, from the ground up, you sort of get the concept of truth values to just sort of materialize sort of out of thin air. I mean, that's the whole formal background here that we're using. But the nothing that we're building up from is this in some sense. I mean, this is we destroy this as much as possible. And the result is that enriching over this completely trivial thing gives you this slightly non-trivial thing that's actually very interesting. It gives you the truth values. There's the empty enriched category, and there's the non-empty enriched category. And the empty one functions like false, and the non-empty one functions like true. And then, you could keep on piggybacking, recursively piggybacking, and you get interesting things these ways. So in fact, let's think about this one. Let's think about truth value enriched categories. Right, so I'm piggybacking again. I'm taking this thing here, which we got by piggybacking, and now I'm piggybacking on top of it. So I'm asking you to try to figure out what it is when you have a category that's enriched over the category of truth values.
So now our concept has two elements each.
Not that way to think of it. I mean,
No.
No.
and now your concepts have two choices.
Oh,
about what
they
to
either
do.
be empty or non-empty.
Right, right. Exactly. The concept is either empty or non-empty. Or each concept, so you have two objects, X and Y, and for each pair of objects, you get to answer the question,
Is there a homomorphism or is there not a homomorphism?
yeah, so either true or false, but they're not.
But it also has to be a category.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like true or false as to whether there's an arrow from X to Y.
With X implies Y?
It's very analogous to X implies Y, but it's their name for this kind of thing. A category enriched over truth values. Say it again? So, I mean, it's like you have elements X and Y and Z, and for each pair of them, you get a yes-no question.
Yeah, but the question is, does it
As to whether or not there's an arrow.
If with respect to composition, it's probably the usual thing.
What usual?
Well, I mean, so it does have to obey, so there is this concept of, there is this tensor product of truth values.
Okay.
The tensor product of truth values is actually conjunction, right? Yes.
Right, the Cartesian product of sets restricted to 0 and 1 element sets, right, is 0 times 0 is 0, 0 times 1 is 0, 1 times 1 is 1. So it's called AND. If you think of 0 as false and 1 is true.
Right, so think about what composition is like in this situation, where it's just a yes or no question as to whether there's an arrow.
So it's like tan.
Yeah, it's like and, right? So we're saying that if there's an arrow here, and there's an arrow here, then there's an arrow here. That's how composition works. Does that sound familiar? Anything that works like that? We have sort of something like an arrow.
Come on,
You
guys.
loop that.
This is a well-known thing.
Yeah. I think the thing is, see, we're in a situation where the arrows have no individuality, right? Because there's an O1 between any pair of, it's either, an empty or non-empty. So you sort of don't have to draw the arrow. You just, let's draw this little head of the arrow.
All arrows are the same thing, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
All arrows from X to Y are the same.
But I'm
Either zero or one.
trying to make a joke here about this. What's a little bit like a ordering? Yeah, an order. I guess it could be more equal.
So it's called a partially ordered set.
Yeah, called a partially ordered set.
Or a pre-order, if you want to be really.
So it's a very simple but very useful kind of category, and it's the next thing that appears in this hierarchy when you start piggybacking on top of creating new, more highly enriched categories, like piggybacking on top of the previous kind. And you can keep on going like this. And there's probably a lot of interesting things to say about that, but let's think about how it's relevant to what we're doing over here. Yeah, so the way that it's relevant to what we're doing over here is that
So we're thinking of the category, the process getting from vector space to category, and that has this data creation be piggybacked.
exactly. So we need some sort of process, and I guess, yeah, right. We need a decategorization process that goes from categories. We separate those right there. From categories to complex vectors. So if you have a process like that, then we'll get, by piggybacking, we'll get a process from category enriched categories to vector space enriched categories. Maybe I'll call this D, and I'll call this piggybacking of D. But I'll have to modify this a little bit, because we don't really want just plain ordinary categories here. We want some sort of nice categories, actually. So this is a placeholder terminology. Definition that I haven't given
definition for nice yet.
Yeah, no, this is just a very temporary placeholder terminology.
It's one that doesn't scratch.
That doesn't scratch. I thought it worked meant a category. That was meant a category. So I guess part of the point I was trying to make with this whole piggybacking idea is that this piggybacking idea gives some idea of how there can be many different kinds of decategorification processes that are all have some sort of family resemblance to each other. So decategorification processes tend to turn higher dimensional categories into lower dimensional categories. And a higher dimensional category is where the Hom sets are themselves categories. And then if it's really high dimensional, then the Hom sets in those categories are categories, and so forth. And decategorification processes tend to lower the dimension, tend to take it from higher dimensional categories down to lower dimensional categories. And you create new decategorification processes by piggybacking old decategorification processes. And that means that the way that these decategorification processes tend to work is that the way that you make the things lower dimensional is by cutting off the top dimension. I mean, you might imagine there's probably some way where you could like cut it off the bottom, but that probably wouldn't qualify as a decategorification process. When I say the bottom and the top, I mean the bottom is sort of closer to the object level, and the top is closer to the morphism level. And when people draw objects and morphisms like dots and arrows, that gives a sort of geometric interpretation of this high dimension versus low dimension. In the pictures, the dots look low dimensional, and the arrows look high dimensional. And then if you have a higher dimensional category, then the arrows between arrows look even higher dimensional. They look like surfaces connecting the arrows. So decategorification processes tend to kill off the really high dimensional stuff. And this piggybacking process sort of shows you, if you think about how the piggybacking process works, it sort of shows you that that's a tendency, that what you're killing off in a decategorification process tends to be the stuff in the high dimension. Yeah, question.
Yeah, so is there a way to kind of use this high versus low dimension way to kind of sort out the things like forgetful functors you were saying 2 weeks ago are an example, not an example of decategorification?
Well, they're too general, and I mean there's probably some special cases that qualify as decategorification. So you can think of much more general examples of forgetful functors than these ones that qualify as decategorification processes. But yeah, go ahead.
I was trying to think about where a forgetful functor does something to the object, so it looks like a low-dimensional kind of thing.
So we do the one from the category of vector space to the category of that's something like that. Yeah. Where it also kind of
Well, yeah, all of vector space itself, or us set by itself, you don't normally think of that as having objects and as points or something like that.
Well, with the category of vector space.
Yeah.
And then decategorify that, or forgetful functor to the category of set. And in a sense, the category of vector space is.
Yeah. Well, the category of sets is still just as much of a category as the category of vector space was.
Right,
but really decategorified.
But there's a forgetful functor that we're not really.
Well, that's not the kind of decategorification as much as these others,
Right,
right?
that's what I'm saying.
Set. It's a forgetful functor, but I would never
But
call it
doesn't,
decategorification.
But if you went from the category of vector spaces to the set of isomorphism classes of vector spaces, that would be a decategorification process.
Isn't that kind of, isn't the category, maybe I'm wrong, but the category of sets is kind of, is there Hom sets are more than just sets in the category of vector spaces?
Right.
Whereas when we move it down to sets, we've lost that. So it's almost like that was when he's piggybacking off of going from.
Yes, so the thing that we're piggybacking off of there isn't particularly a decategorification. So if you piggyback something that you don't feel like calling the original something a decategorification process, then the piggyback thing is going to feel like a decategorification process.
Yeah, that's what you're trying to get at. Some forgetful functors aren't don't qualify for this thing, right?
Yeah, it's we're treating this at a very vague level at the moment.
Yeah, I guess then, I was like, is there an example you can give where, because this process is low dimensional, it therefore is not what we're considering decategorification? Is there a process you use to decategorize this low, that works on the object, not on the?
Yeah, I can give you a sort of silly example. Well, so I mean, I gave the example of thinking of pi 0 of a topological space. That's a set of components. I gave the example of thinking of that as a decategorification process. Now, if you took pi 1 of that instead, and I guess you need pi 1 of pointed space or something like that, because pi 1 isn't even well defined. The fundamental group, pi 1.
But then it's pi 0 very silly on that pointed space instead, right?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I have to include the point in the first place, that already is a giveaway that this isn't really a good decategorification process. But the fact that pi 1 is, higher dimensional, it's not very high dimensional, it's, pi 3 is even higher dimensional. But these higher homotopy groups, if you just take a higher homotopy group and leave out pi 0, that's not really what I would think of as a decategorification process, because you're cutting it off at the means, kind of. A decategorification process, you have to really dig at the mean. Just the mean up to the mean. It's like blasting away. Yeah, but I mean, we're still treating this on a very vague level. So. I guess I really need to say what kind of nice categories I'm talking about here. Well, let's see. Okay, this is what I really mean by nice in this context. I mean that it's so nice that it's actually groupoid in disguise. I guess in order to do that nice, you have to actually like groupoids. And actually, probably a lot of people don't like groupoids, but I like them. And by in disguise, what I really mean is that it's the I'll say it's the category of category of G sets for some groupoid G. So, right, that's kind of good. Yeah, go ahead. So,
With what morphisms on a G set?
Morphisms between the G sets?
Yes. Because over here we specified that our morphisms are expander G-sets, which themselves are a category.
Right.
And that seems like what we're looking for is, it seems like what, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah.
So I've already told them how to think of a G set as a functor from a group to the category of sets.
Right. And
So
that
they
was
didn't know what a G set is for a
generalization of that.
groupoid. Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the first question is how happy are people with the concept of a groupoid? So a groupoid is a lot like a group, but a group is a special kind of category, especially in two ways. It's only got one object,
And all the objects are included.
all the morphisms are
All the
included.
morphisms.
Right. The groupoid just keeps one of those restrictions, namely the one about all the morphisms are invertible, but it can have many objects. And it's very relevant here, actually, to notice why groupoids have often been not very popular. In some sense, they're often less popular, not only less popular than groups, but they're also often less popular than categories. And there's a particular reason for that, which is, but first of all, a groupoid is a special kind of category. It's a category where all of the morphisms are invertible. All the morphisms are isomorphic. And so think about what that means. You have a category, all the morphisms are isomorphisms. And that means that in some sense, this particular category, which is a groupoid, falls to pieces because there are like separate isomorphism classes that don't interact with each other at all. In a category, you can have separate isomorphism classes that interact in very interesting ways. Because you can have non-invertible morphisms that go from one isomorphism class to another. But in a groupoid, you can't, because all the morphisms are invertible. So a groupoid just naturally falls into pieces that seem completely non-interactive, completely separate. And people naturally have a tendency to study those pieces instead. Because, it seems like there's so little interaction between the pieces, you might as well just study one piece all by itself.
And each piece is kind of like studying
Each piece,
class of groups.
right. I mean, each piece could have many objects, but they're all isomorphic, which means it might as well, it's equivalent to a category with just a single object. And that category with just a single object is a group. So that's how groupoids get to be not so popular. Because people say, oh, it seems like overkill. Because if you have a category with the property of being a groupoid, it falls to pieces, and each piece is basically a group, and people just study group theory instead of studying group. People just study group theory instead of studying groupoid theory. But it turns out that this is somewhat unfortunate, because you're actually overlooking some interesting things when you try to force groupoid theory to become group theory instead. There's actually some very interesting stuff that happens. And I can try this now. So, there's another part of the story, this story about why groupoids are unpopular. There's another thing that's unpopular, and it's really for the same reason. And that other thing that's unpopular is the zeroth homology of groups. And again, there's a pretty good reason why the zero homology of groups is unpopular. So first of all, what is homology of groups about? Homology and or cohomology? Well, homology groups and cohomology groups, those are really things that more properly spaces should have than groups. And for space, it's actually interesting to think about. For topological space, it's interesting to think about the zero homology of the space. And or the zero cohomology of the space. It essentially counts the number of components of your space. It's a lot like pi zero. Pi zero is the set of components. H sub zero is the free vector space on the set of components. But groups are things that you can turn into spaces. See, I guess it's a whole long story about this, and I can't tell the whole story right now. But what I would say is that one way you can think about how groups get their homology and cohomology groups is that they get them really because you get spaces from groups. I guess it's something called the classifying space of the group. And then you take the homology and or cohomology of that space, and that's what the group cohomology is, or the group homology and the group cohomology. When I put, if I put group in front of homology, I'm talking about the homology of the group. Group homology means homology of groups. But on the other hand, I also say homology groups, because the homology of everything is a group. I guess we talk about group homology groups, but I've never heard anybody say that.
No, I can say classified space, I mean, like I've heard it from
Yes, yeah. And there's a really good reason why the zero homology of groups is boring. Because when you turn a group into a space, you just get a space with one component. So the zero homology is boring. It's always just one-dimensional vector space. Or if you're doing with homology with coefficients taken from a field, then you're getting the homology, so-called homology group being actually a vector space. And so it's just a one-dimensional vector space if you're doing with groups. But of course, with groupoids, you're not just getting a one-dimensional homology vector space. You're getting the dimension of the dimension of H sub 0. You're getting that equal to the number of isomorphism classes of objects in the groupoid. So it's actually interesting. And but it doesn't become really interesting until you start considering a certain concept called transfer. So the process of taking the homology groups of a space or of a group or of a groupoid such a process is often called a homology theory or cohomology theory or something like that. And a homology theory, that's actually the homology process, that's a covariant function. Taking the homology groups of some space is a covariant functor of the space. As the space varies, this is a covariant functor. A cohomology theory, this is a contravariant functor. Again, a contravariant functor of the space. When you think of the space that you're taking the cohomology groups of, when you think of that space as the variable, this is a contravariant functor. So homology gives you induced morphisms that go the same direction as the maps that induce them. Cohomology gives you induced morphisms that go in the backwards direction, contravariant. But it turns out that's not the end of the story. It turns out that these really get mixed up with each other. It turns out that in a lot of contexts, homology actually ends up being contravariant in addition to being covariant, and cohomology ends up being covariant in addition to being contravariant. So sometimes it gets really hard to tell the difference between homology and cohomology. What I'm saying here is that so if you have some spaces, x and y, and a map between them, then if you take their homology groups, you get an induced map between them. I guess it's sometimes indicated that way. And let's see, if you take their cohomology groups, indicated by superscripts instead of subscripts, then you get an induced map going the other way. And it's, again, sometimes indicated by superscript there. That means if I have another arrow over here, let's see, suppose I have one going this way. And I have the zeroth cohomology here. Let's see, I guess for this example, I guess I'll try and use homology actually. All right, I'll try and use homology. I want the maps going like this. And by the way, you might notice it's beginning to look like a span, except that I didn't draw the middle part raised, but it is a span. And take the homology groups. Then you can take this morphism n, and we're taking homology groups, and homology is covariant. So of course, you automatically get this induced morphism here. That's a perfectly sensible thing to do. Nothing surprising about it at all. But it turns out that in certain circumstances, there's this surprising thing that you can do, which is that you can get a morphism going the wrong way, which is called the transfer. And in that case, let's see, so this morphism is going from Y to X, and homology is covariant, so we're expecting to get something this way. And the surprising thing is that we get something called the transfer that goes this way. I'm not sure what the big really is for it, but it's called the transfer sometimes.
Transfer comes from a map from X to Y, or X to Y.
It's coming from this map from Y to X.
And then can you find that came from that X to Y?
No, it usually doesn't. It usually doesn't. It's just a map that lives down here, not a map that lives up here. Yeah, so we're saying that maps that live up here can induce maps in both directions. That's what happens. I'll try to give some very concrete examples of this in a moment.
And lower star, and lower star transfer.
Say that again?
And lower star transfer.
And lower star is just the ordinary induced map. This, I think the transfer, now I'm going to think about it. I think it's called something like, I think this is sometimes called N sub read or N sub
Super
back.
shriek.
Really?
No, the two ain't contrary.
Should be
Oh.
N.
Sorry. M super shriek.
But
So you said that it doesn't come from a morphism, or is it somehow coming from the morphism?
I thought his question was whether it comes from a morphism coming from the same way.
I was saying, is there a theorem that says, oh, and by the way, it also comes from, there is also morphism going the same way, that's produced by,
Yeah.
normally by the homology.
Yeah, that would mean that there was that would mean that you could take this morphism here and get a morphism up here going the other way.
Yeah.
But that's not what happens. The morphism going the other way is down here. It's called M, sometimes called M super shriek.
Doesn't shriek already stand for the fact that it's the transfer and one of the things the homology was, so it should be said? Seems like you're double encoding the fact that it was turned around.
So whether it's superscript or subscript, is that where I'm going? I honestly don't know. John gave an argument that since it's contravariant, if it's going the wrong way, that it's a superscript. But so the shriek indicates two things, I think. This exclamation mark. It indicates that in wartime France they're doing everything on typewriters and they just this was a leftover key on the typewriter that they could use for notation. But the other thing it indicates is that it's surprising. It's supposed to, right? This is a mundane thing that you always get because homology is covariant. This is supposed to be surprising. That, homology is somehow behaving contravariantly. We switch the direction of the arrow. So people put the surprise sign there, allegedly. Exclamation, yeah. And, but in a way I would argue that it shouldn't really be that surprising. In a way it really makes perfect sense that you get this map going, quote, the wrong way. And in fact, it's more of a surprise that this doesn't always work. I mean, in some sense, you really should be entitled to get this to work. So let me argue for why I'm entitled to get it to work, and let me try to connect that to what we're doing with spans here. So I want to give you a really simple example of transfer. Suppose you have finite sets S and T and a map between them. And you can think of finite sets as very simple examples of topological space. So you can take the zero homology. And so you get this map M. You get the mundane one, because the obvious thing. And it is just obvious. I mean, this is the free vector space, this is the free vector space on T, and this is just the obvious induced map. But the surprising one, the allegedly surprising one, is like this. Let's see if we get a concrete example here. Let's have S be S be a two-element set, and let's have S be a three-element set, and let's have T be a two-element set, and A and B go to C, C goes to E. So this is a three-dimensional vector space over here. This is a two-dimensional vector space over here. And the mundane map is this map that, let's see, so again, we have this problem with matrices where I draw them backwards from everybody else, but I'm drawing it as a 3 by 2 matrix. We have this basis ABC for the homology over here. And we have this basis DE for the homology over here. And the map is simply A goes to D, B goes to B, and C goes to E. That's the mundane thing. The surprising one is this, the allegedly surprising one. It really didn't be much of a surprise. This thing going from DE vector space, the ABC vector space. Anybody guess what it is? Just thinking matrix-wise? The transpose, yeah. So
transfer and transpose are just names of the same thing.
yeah, I never really figured out where the name transfer came from. It doesn't have that feel to me of going the wrong way, but maybe the trans does, as in, transpose. Somehow make it feel like you're going the wrong way.
So the fact that the transfer exists is the reason why you and everyone else can't agree on matrix.
Right, that's right. That's right. So yeah, it's hard to tell which one is the transferred, which one is the normal one. But you can tell because of the direction of the arrow, I guess. But see, the real reason why it's supposed to be obvious that you can do transfer in this context is because, see, you're trying to get from the vector space with this basis to the vector space with this basis. And there's an obvious sort of formula to get from linear combinations of these things to linear combinations of these things. And the formula is basically called summing over the fiber. So you start out with a point here, and you see these lines here connecting up to the points over here. And so the fiber over the element D is the element A, B. And you sort of can't make up your mind about which element to go to. But the fact that we can add things together lets us sum over the fibers, and we just take the sum of them. And that's what this math is doing.
So you give the equal coefficients.
Yeah, right. You give everything, I guess, in the case of coefficients of 1, I guess. And that's what this transpose is really doing. And this is allowing us to have maps to do things going the wrong way. And that means that spans can induce things. Because a span is made up of a partially wrong way thing and a partially right way thing. But both of those parts can induce something going the right way. And this is how spans give matrices. So if you work this out, this is one way to think about how spans give matrices. So if you have like 3 points here and 2 points here, and then if you have a set see, there's like a map here that takes these 3 things and these 3 things, and a map here that takes these 2 things for these 2 things. This is a picture of a span, but you can also think of it as a picture of a matrix, right? This is a matrix. The entries are 3, 1, 0, 1, 2, 2. And this matrix that you get is actually, it represents the linear operator that you get if you have the wrong way part gives the transfer, and the right way part gives the map, and then you just compose them, and that will give the operator that's represented by this matrix here.
Right, so I've already talked about how spans of finite sets turn into matrices of numbers, and this is a more detailed analysis of
Right.
the same thing.
Right. This is a more detailed analysis. But so far, I've only given examples with finite sets. The really interesting examples for us are the examples with groupoids, which are slightly more complicated spaces. So I gave a sort of homology interpretation of how to think of spans between finite sets as giving you matrices. But because we're using homology, this works not just for finite sets. It works for anything that has a homology, really, as long as the transfer works. And groupoids can be turned into spaces just as finite sets can be turned into spaces. And groupoids have homology groups just as sets have homology groups. So this process that we're talking about here, involving using summing over the fiber to go backwards, lets us turn groupoids into vector spaces. Sorry. I'm having trouble keeping track of the line between the cameras here. Let me write it over here. We're going to turn groupoids into vector spaces. And we're going to turn spans into linear operators. Yeah, so groupoid turns into a vector space. A span turns into a linear operator. And this happens by means of the transfer trick. This process is what we'll call degroupoidification. Although you can also think of it as zero homology for groupoids.
So then you're going to piggyback off that.
If piggyback off of this, yeah. I I'm very annoyed I didn't complete it today. I had to do it all day. So we're out of time. This is the decategorification process that we're going to use. But I still have a lot more to explain about it. I mean, we've barely even said anything about how this zero homology works for groupoids. The examples that I gave, these very trivial examples that I gave over here, just involve finite steps. I really have to explain how it works for groupoids. And then after that, I have to explain how we're going to apply this process in our example. So there's still a lot of work to do.
I'll also talk about that same stuff, because that's where my talks were marching.
Yeah, I know, right. We are both heading in the same direction, but,
So hopefully they'll interfere constructively.
yeah, I was supposed to be done with this today so they could use it next time, but it didn't work out that way.